It seems,
Recording in progress.
oops, jumped the gun there. It seems like today's readings involve a lot of traveling. In the first reading from Exodus, the Jews are on the first part of their epic journey from Egypt back to Israel. We know from history the challenges of their journey, and it does not seem like they were able to find a Holiday Inn in the Sinai Peninsula, but rather than a chocolate on their pillow, they got something much greater, as we hear today of the generous covenant that God makes with his people at that time. The second reading, or the second reading from, in the gospel rather, from Matthew, we hear of Jesus sending his apostles on a journey, one that is designed to preach and heal in a miraculous way, another extraordinary trip. Though actually, I would prefer if the language were not so exclusionary as to who benefited and who did not. And I'll chalk that one up to the directive not of Jesus, but rather to the cultural bias of the writers a generation or two after his life. We know a little bit about travel ourselves. Mimi and I, just having returned from a 2-week tour of Scotland and Ireland. And while we did not have to wander in the desert for 40 years, after spending 2 weeks checking in and out of hotels, including an unexpected delay overnight in London for a missed connection, I think we could relate in some small way to that epic journey. In the course of our trip, there was plenty of time for conversation and stories. And while some of them may have been inspired by the famous Blarney Castle, one story in particular struck us. One of our traveling companions by the name of Jane told us the story of her family's trip to Lourdes many years before. This trip was no ordinary trip. Its genesis having begun with her young daughters seeing the movie The Song of Bernadette in parochial school. It seems her daughter had been diagnosed with cystic fibrosis at a young age, and her parents were told she would likely have a life expectancy of 10 years, 15 years if they were lucky. Her daughter, with the innocence of a young child, felt that if she could bathe in the waters of Lourdes, she would be healed. You can imagine what that put her family through. And after some deliberation and a bit of lingering doubt, they made the decision to take the trip, and their daughter was able to bathe in the water of Lourdes. While there was plenty of evidence of miracles in the abandoned wheelchairs and crutches around the grotto, no such wonder took place for them. Her daughter was undeterred, however, and with the innocent faith of a young child, insisted that her mother leave behind her many medications. As you can well imagine, that created a tearful dilemma for Jane, who, despite her daughter's faith, could not bring herself to leave the medication behind. When they returned home, Jane was telling the story of their visit to a nun in their parish, and she remarked that she did not have the same carefree and joyous experiences those she saw around her. The astute nun replied that perhaps it was because the others she observed had come as tourists while they were there as pilgrims. This led me to think about today's readings in the context of a pilgrimage and make me wonder what that might be about. The Jews were clearly on a pilgrimage back to their homeland. The apostles seemed to be on a pilgrimage to spread the word and bring healing. There are many other examples of religious pilgrimages that we're familiar with. The annual trek of the Muslims to Mecca. Some have made the trip to the site of apparitions in Medjugorje. The month-long journey that many pilgrims make along the Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain. So what is it about a pilgrimage that makes it different from an ordinary tourist trip? One definition talks of a pilgrimage as a journey, especially a long one, made to some sacred place as an act of religious devotion with the expectation of miraculous results or dramatic inner transformation. I'd say that's pretty dramatic stuff, isn't it? And a pretty difficult standard to achieve if you're looking to be a pilgrim. Looking at that standard, it would seem that the experiences would be few and far between. So now I have to ask myself, why do we refer to ourselves as a pilgrim church? What hope can we all have in the ordinariness of everyday life to meet the exceptional criteria of a pilgrim? How few and far between do we get to experience what I like to refer to as a soul quake, an encounter experience that resonates in our being from the top of our head to our toes, almost like an electric shock. So rather than being discouraged, however, I think the answer might not be in the incidents, but actually in the perspective. And I think Albert Einstein said it so well. You may have heard this quote: there are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle. If we take this perspective, that everything around us is a miracle or full of wonder, then perhaps the very ordinary acts of our lives, as well as the more exceptional ones, become worthy of calling ourselves true pilgrims on the journey. Certainly the experience we heard last week during reflection, I think it was Pat McKittrick, tells of crying together with a homeless person on the floor of a restroom in Penn Station over a gift of a McDonald's meal, qualifies as a pilgrim experience. But not every pilgrim action or activity has to be, as I referred to, as a soul quake like this one. However, there's a common denominator. It does show a journey, but maybe not a physical one, but a journey of the heart that is designed ideally to change both the originator and the receiver. Both the simple as well as the sublime qualify if we view it that way. In today's second reading, Joan Chittister gives us wonderful direction as pilgrims. To quote her, "We must follow Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem, contending with the system, healing the people, doing good. We must give ourselves to the task of bringing about God's peaceable kingdom wherever we are, whatever we do," and I might add the words, however big or small. So before I close, I'd like to circle back to the story that I shared earlier about our traveling companion, Jane, and the pilgrimage she took with her daughter to Lourdes. There was certainly no dramatic moment or startling change, and it would be easy to say that their pilgrimage went unrequited. But I think the truth is far from that, as this young girl with a life expectancy of 10 just recently turned 38. She continues to take her medication and still has a lot of health issues, but I would say she continues to qualify as a pilgrim in her life's journey. So what about the rest of us? Quoting Joan Chittister once again, if we begin the journey and stay on the road, listening to the voice of God and responding to it with all our gifts and goodness, we will find that God stands waiting to sustain us, support us, and fulfill us at every turn. Maybe then we'll qualify to be called a pilgrim church. So let me conclude by saying, good travels, my fellow pilgrims.